It wasn't a phone call I was expecting on a Tuesday morning in February. I was at my kitchen table in our apartment in Hamilton, Ontario, eating cereal that had gone soft because I'd been sitting there too long staring at nothing. My wife. I'll call her my wife, because after 7 years together, she is exactly that, even if the paperwork says otherwise. She was in the shower. I could hear the pipes rattling in the walls the way they always did. That was one of the things I'd learned to live with. The rattling pipe, the neighbor upstairs, who walked like he was trying to find something he'd dropped through the floor. The parking spot we shared with the unit next door, even though the lease said it was ours alone. I'd learned to live with a lot of things in that apartment, but the call that morning was not something I could learn to live with. It was our property manager. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She told me that the building had been acquired by a company called Meridian Capital Group sometime in the fall, that the new ownership had filed the necessary paperwork with the landlord and tenant board, and that we were being issued an N13, a notice to terminate for demolition. They were converting the building, not renovating, demolishing our floor entirely to expand the commercial space below. She said we had 120 days. I said, 120 days to do what? She said, to vacate. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear long after she'd hung up. My wife came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, hair dripping, and she knew something was wrong the moment she saw my face. I told her. She sat down across from me, and we didn't say anything for a long time. We just sat there in that kitchen, with the soft cereal and the rattling pipes and the sound of the neighbor upstairs, doing whatever it is he always did up there. We had 120 days to find somewhere else to live in a city where the average rent for a two-bedroom had just crossed $2,400 a month. We were not rich people. I worked in logistics for a mid-sized company downtown. My wife taught ESL at a community center 3 days a week and took on private students the other 2. We were not struggling, exactly, but we were not the kind of people who could absorb $2,400 a month for a new apartment on top of the moving costs, the first and last, the deposits, all of it landing in the same month. We started looking. We looked every day for 6 weeks. We saw places that made the apartment we were losing feel like a palace. We saw a bachelor unit being rented as a one-bedroom. We saw a basement suite where the landlord referred to the half window at ceiling level as lots of natural light. We put in applications. We got turned down twice. Once because my wife's income was classified as self-employed, which apparently made us a risk, and once for reasons the landlord never explained and wasn't required to. The clock was running. My father-in-law called one evening in March. He'd heard about our situation from my wife, and he had something he wanted to run by us. He was a quiet man, the kind who didn't offer opinions unless he'd already thought them through completely, so when he said he had something to run by us, I listened. He told us about a property he'd come across through an old colleague of his. A farmhouse on about 12 acres outside a small town called Mildmay, up in Bruce County, 2 hours north of Hamilton. The place had been sitting vacant for going on 4 years, ever since the previous owner passed away with no immediate family to inherit it. The estate had been administered through the courts, and the property had finally cleared probate and was being offered as is for $189,000. My wife looked at me across the kitchen table. $189,000. In 2024 in Ontario, for 12 acres and a house, even a derelict one, that number sounded like a misprint. What's wrong with it? I asked. My father-in-law paused. What isn't wrong with it, he said, is the land. Good bones on the house. Probably, if you're willing to look past the surface. We drove up on a Saturday in late March, when the snow was still heavy on the ground, and the road into the property was more mud than gravel. The farmhouse sat back from the road maybe 200 meters, half hidden behind a row of old spruce trees that the wind had bent slightly sideways over the decades. The porch was caved in on one end. 2 of the upper windows were boarded over with plywood that had warped and split. The paint, whatever color it had once been, was so weathered it had become the color of the wood underneath. My wife reached over and took my hand. I didn't know if it was because she was hopeful or because she was terrified. Maybe both. We walked around the outside first. The foundation was poured concrete, solid, no visible cracking. The roof was missing shingles in patches, but the pitch was steep enough that the structure underneath looked like it had survived. The barn at the back had collapsed on one side entirely, but my father-in-law had already said the barn was a write-off. Inside was worse than the outside. There was a smell of damp and old wood and something else, something I couldn't name, but that felt like time itself sitting heavy in the air. The kitchen had a hole in the linoleum the size of a dinner plate. The main staircase had 2 steps missing. The living room ceiling had a brown stain spreading from one corner that told the story of many winters of slow water damage. But the floors, under the grime and the peeling remnants of old rugs, were wide plank hardwood. Old growth, my father-in-law said, running his boot along the edge. They don't make this anymore. My wife stood in the middle of what had once been the living room and turned slowly in a full circle. Then she looked at me and said, "We could do this." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not saying it would be easy. I'm saying we could do it." We drove back to Hamilton that afternoon talking through the numbers. We had $40,000 in savings. Not a lot for a renovation, but enough to make a start. The mortgage on $189,000 at current rates would run us around $100 a month, less than half of what a new Hamilton apartment would cost. I could work remotely 2 days a week and commute the other 3. My wife could shift her private students to online. It would be tight. It would be more than tight. We made an offer the following week. The estate accepted it. The day we got the keys was a Thursday in April. We drove up after work, the back of my truck loaded with cleaning supplies and a box of tools and a cooler with food for the weekend. We pulled into that mud driveway as the last light was going out of the sky, and the farmhouse was just a dark shape against the tree line. No lights, obviously. No heat. We'd have to get the propane sorted before winter. No running water yet, either. My wife stood outside while I unlocked the front door. She said, "This is insane." I said, "Probably." She said, "Let's do it anyway." The first 2 months were brutal in the way that any project is brutal when you've underestimated it and can't afford to quit. We gutted the kitchen on the first weekend. We replaced the missing stairs. We tore out the ceiling in the living room and found, to our relief, that the water damage hadn't reached the substructure. It had been a slow leak from a failed flashing around the chimney, and the chimney itself was solid old fieldstone, one of those hand-laid structures that would outlast everything else on the property. My father-in-law came up every second weekend. He was useful in ways I hadn't anticipated. He'd grown up in a simpler farmhouse in the Kawarthas, and he understood old buildings the way you only do if you've lived in them. He showed me how to read the house, how to understand what was cosmetic damage and what was structural. Most of it was cosmetic. The bones, as he'd said, were good. It was during one of those weekends in late June that I noticed something I couldn't explain. I was measuring the back hallway, the one that ran behind the kitchen and connected to the mudroom, trying to figure out how much trim we'd need for the baseboards. I measured the outside of the house along that wall in the morning, and then I measured the inside hallway in the afternoon, and the numbers didn't match. The inside measurement was nearly 4 feet shorter than it should have been based on the exterior. I stood in the hallway for a long time, measuring again, then again. 4 feet of the farmhouse was unaccounted for. I went and got my father-in-law. He brought his own tape measure and did it himself, and then he stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and said, I said, "What does it mean?" He said, "It means I don't know yet." We spent the rest of that afternoon pressing and tapping along the interior wall, the one that separated the hallway from what I'd assumed was the outside of the house. The drywall in that section was old, much older than the drywall in the rest of the hallway. Older finishing nails, different texture. My father-in-law put his ear against the wall and knocked, and then he said, "That's hollow. Not hollow like a wall, hollow like a room." We took a utility knife and scored along the seam where the old drywall met the baseboard, and I pried it back at the corner, and behind it there was a door. Not a hidden door in the cinematic sense. No secret panel, no hidden latch. Just a regular interior door that someone had drywalled over. The hinges were still there. The handle had been removed, and the hole where it had been was packed with insulation, which was why I hadn't felt the draft. I got a pry bar and worked around the frame until the whole drywalled section came loose, and there was the door. Old solid core wood, painted over multiple times. The most recent paint was a color I recognized from the rest of the house, that original pale green that had been everywhere when we bought it. Whoever drywalled this door over had done it at the same time as the last major renovation of the house, which, based on everything else, was sometime in the 1980s. My wife was in town getting groceries. I called her and told her to come back. She said, "Is something wrong?" I said, "No, just come back." The door was locked, and the lock was an old skeleton key type. We spent 40 minutes trying every key on the ring the estate had given us before my father-in-law just got a hammer and knocked the entire mechanism through the door. The wood around the lock was soft enough that it gave without much resistance. The door swung inward. The air that came out was cold and still and smelled of oil and old paper. My wife was standing behind me with her phone flashlight on. I stepped inside. It was a room, maybe 12 feet by 10. The ceiling was low. I had to duck slightly where the roofline came down on one side. Along the left wall, 3 metal filing cabinets, the old green kind, army surplus looking. Along the right wall, a wooden workbench with nothing on it except an old coffee tin full of nails and a rusted hand plane. Against the far wall, a wooden shelving unit, and on the shelves, cardboard boxes, maybe 20 of them. The boxes were sealed with packing tape that had dried and cracked and come partially loose. On the floor in the center of the room there was a rug, and on the rug there was a steel lockbox, the kind you'd use to transport cash or documents, about the size of a shoebox. I looked at my wife. She looked at the lockbox. She said, "I feel like we should call someone." I said, "Call who?" She didn't have an answer for that. We left the lockbox for the moment and opened the filing cabinets first. The drawers were full of hanging file folders, paper documents, some typed, and some handwritten. The language was technical. Land descriptions, lot numbers, legal descriptions referencing concession roads and surveyor coordinates. There were photocopies of survey maps. There were receipts for equipment, tractors, grain augers, storage bins. There were records of crop yields going back to the 1960s. This had been the farm's administrative room. The place where the previous owner, whoever had last run this as an active farm, had kept the paper record of everything. The name on most of the documents was Russell. Harold Russell. The farmhouse had belonged to the Russell family, and based on the dates on the documents, Harold Russell had run a mixed grain and cattle operation here from roughly 1954 until the early 1980s, when the records stopped. The boxes on the shelves turned out to be more of the same. Personal correspondence, mostly. Seed catalogs. An old ledger book for the cattle sales, rows of dates and weights and prices per hundredweight at the Walkerton auction. And then, in the second-to-last box, I found something that stopped me. It was a folder manila, held together with a rubber band that snapped the moment I touched it. Inside were documents that were different from everything else in the room. Different paperweight, different formatting. These were land title documents, but not for this property. For properties all across Bruce County. Lot 14, Concession 7, Kincardine Township. Lot 22, Concession 3, Brant Township. Half a dozen more. They were deeds. Old deeds, some of them going back to the 1940s, and every single one of them had Harold Russell's name on one side and a company name on the other. Norland Properties Limited. I had never heard of Norland Properties. I photographed every page of the folder with my phone and put it back carefully. That night we slept in sleeping bags on the living room floor, the way we'd been doing for the first weeks, and I lay there in the dark, looking at the ceiling while my wife breathed steadily beside me. Something about those documents was sitting wrong in my chest. Not the documents themselves. They were just paper, just old business records. It was what they implied. Harold Russell had sold parcels of land to this company going back decades, small pieces, one at a time, not unusual for a farmer trying to stay afloat. But then, what was the folder doing sealed in a room that had been drywalled shut? I started searching for Norland properties the next morning on my phone. It took less than an hour to find something that made me set the phone down and stare at the field outside the kitchen window for a long time. Norland Properties Limited had been dissolved as a provincial corporation in 2019. Before that, it had been a subsidiary of a holding company called Regent Northern Capital, which was itself registered in British Columbia. Regent Northern Capital was currently under investigation by the Ontario Securities Commission for a series of transactions involving agricultural land in Grey and Bruce counties dating back to the late 1980s. The investigation had been reported in the Owen Sound Sun-Times 2 years earlier and had apparently gone quiet since. One of the land parcels mentioned in the news article matched a lot number in Harold Russell's folder almost exactly. I called my wife into the kitchen and showed her. She read the article twice. Then she looked at the folder of documents. Then at me. She said, "We need to talk to someone who understands this." We drove to Owen Sound on a Monday morning and walked into the offices of a property lawyer there. An older woman, maybe 65, who had the kind of desk that told you she'd been practicing for a long time and had stopped trying to impress anyone. I explained what we'd found. She looked at the photographs on my phone for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Where did you say this property was?" I told her. I told her about Harold Russell. I told her about the hidden room and the sealed box and the documents. She said, "Mr. Russell passed away in 2020. Is that right?" I said I thought so. That was what the estate documentation had said. She said, "Did you open the lockbox?" I said we hadn't been able to. We'd brought it with us, actually. I'd carried it out of the farmhouse and put it in the truck. She asked if she could see it. I went to the truck and brought it in. She looked at the lockbox for a moment. She said, "I know someone who would want to see these documents." She said it carefully, the way people say things carefully when they mean more than the words. "There's an investigator with the OSC who has been looking for documentation related to Norland Properties for a long time. The issue has been that when the company was dissolved, the principals claimed all the original transaction records had been lost. Destroyed in a flood, they said, at a storage facility in Barrie. The OSC has been working from secondary sources." I said, "And if the original records weren't lost?" She looked at me. She said, "Then the principals who made that claim would have a significant problem." We did not immediately understand the full scope of what we were sitting on. That understanding came gradually, over the following 3 months, in pieces. The lawyer made the introduction to the OSC investigator. The investigator came to the farmhouse on a Tuesday in July with a colleague, and they spent 4 hours in that hidden room, going through everything. They wore gloves. They photographed everything before they moved it. They took the lockbox. The lock on the box was opened by a locksmith they brought with them. Inside was more paper, but different from everything else. These were personal notes in Harold Russell's handwriting, a kind of running account, written over several years in the 1980s and early 1990s, of conversations he'd had and transactions he'd been part of, and things he'd been told to do, and things he'd refused to do, and things he'd witnessed. Harold Russell, it turned out, had not been a willing participant in what Norland Properties was doing. He'd been a reluctant one, and then a coerced one, and at some point in the early 1990s, he'd started writing things down. Not because he'd planned to do anything with it, as far as I could tell from what the investigators eventually told us, but because he was a methodical man and writing things down was how he processed them. He'd sealed the room because he was afraid. He'd stopped adding to the record, and then decades had passed, and the farmhouse had slowly become what we'd found it. The principals behind Norland Properties and Regent Northern Capital had spent 30 years assuming that whatever Harold Russell knew had died with him. They were wrong. I don't want to get too deep into the legal specifics because the case was still unresolved the last time we checked, and our lawyer has advised us to be careful about what we say publicly. What I can tell you is that the OSC investigation accelerated significantly after they went through that room. That the investigator, on her way out the door that July afternoon, turned to me and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the documents we'd found were the kind of thing the investigation had needed and hadn't been able to find through any other means. What I can also tell you is that Harold Russell had, buried in the last pages of his notes, updated his will, handwritten, with 2 witnesses whose names appeared on a separate sheet, and in that will he had left any proceeds arising from the contents of the room to whoever owned the property at the time the room was found. He'd had no children. His closest relatives were cousins he'd been estranged from for decades. He'd wanted someone to find it, I think. He just hadn't known when or who. Our lawyer was very clear about what this meant. The will was valid. It would need to go through probate, which would take time, and the proceeds, if there were any, and to what extent, were not something she could promise us. But the intent was clear. Harold Russell had made a decision, sometime in those last years of his life, that the room and everything in it belonged to whoever came next. That winter was the best winter we'd had in years, even though we were sleeping in a farmhouse that still had plastic sheeting over 2 of the windows, and a propane heater that my father-in-law made me promise to never leave running overnight. We'd gotten the water working. We'd finished the kitchen. We had a proper bedroom upstairs, the walls still bare drywall, but the floor refinished and glowing, that wide plank hardwood that doesn't exist anymore. My wife would come in from feeding the chickens. We'd gotten 6 chickens in October, which was either a brilliant decision or a profoundly stupid one, and we still weren't sure which. And she'd take her boots off at the door and come into the kitchen, where I'd have coffee ready, and she'd look around at what this place was becoming, and something in her face would be different than it had been in Hamilton. Not happier, exactly, more settled, like a person who has found the frequency they were always supposed to be on. The case moved slowly as these things do. There were hearings, there were delays, there were lawyers involved on the other side who were very good at delays. My father-in-law would ask me for updates on Sunday evenings, and I would tell him where things stood, which was usually somewhere between progressing and unclear, and he would nod with the patience of a man who has waited for a lot of things in his life. In the spring, almost exactly a year after we'd first walked through that farmhouse door, the OSC issued formal findings against the principals of Regent Northern Capital. The investigation had uncovered a scheme involving the systematic undervaluation and fraudulent transfer of agricultural land across Gray and Bruce counties over more than 2 decades. Several of the landowners who had transferred parcels to Norland, and Harold Russell had not been the only one, had been misled about the true value of what they were selling. The scheme had been structured carefully enough to avoid easy detection, and it had operated in plain sight for 30 years. The lead investigator said in a public statement that the resolution of the case had been made possible by the discovery of primary source documentation that had been presumed destroyed. We were sitting at our kitchen table when we read that, the same table that now had a proper overhead light and a window we'd repaired, and a view of the field where the snow was finally melting for the second time since we'd arrived. The coffee was hot. The chickens were noisy outside. My wife read the statement twice. She put her phone down. She looked out the window for a moment. She said, "He kept it for a reason." She meant Harold Russell. She meant the room, the notes, all of it. I said, "Yeah, I think he did." She said, "I don't think he thought anyone specific would find it. I think he just needed to know it was there." I didn't say anything to that. I thought she was right. The probate process finished in the fall. I won't share the exact number because it's not really the point, but I'll say this. It was enough to finish the house. It was enough to pay off the truck. It was enough that my wife could take the winter off from teaching for the first time in her adult life and just be here, in this place we'd accidentally built by running out of options and turning left when we should have gone straight back to looking at overpriced Hamilton apartments. The farmhouse is not finished. I'm not sure it ever will be. Old houses have a way of always presenting you with the next thing. The barn is still mostly a ruin. The fencing on the south field needs replacement. There is a stretch of drainage tile on the east side of the property that my father-in-law keeps pointing at meaningfully. But the kitchen is good. The bedroom is good. The living room has a wood stove now, a cast iron one, and on winter evenings, the light from it moves on the old hardwood floors in a way that I couldn't have described to you a year ago because I hadn't seen it yet. My father-in-law drove up for a weekend last November, and we sat by that stove on the Saturday evening, and he asked me. The way he asks things, quietly, not expecting a particular kind of answer, he asked me whether I thought we'd made the right decision. I thought about the apartment in Hamilton, the rattling pipes, the parking spot that was never really ours, the phone call on a Tuesday morning in February. I said, I don't think it was a decision, exactly. I think we just ran out of the other options. He nodded, looking at the fire. He said, that's usually how the good ones go. We sat there for a long time after that, not saying anything, which is the kind of thing you can do when you're somewhere that finally feels like it belongs to you.